The Big 12 and Gonzaga have a mutual admiration for each other, but the latest report is UConn has more momentum right now in the conference realignment sweepstakes. What does this mean for the Zags? And could the Pac-12 get involved and make a push?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege, and when you enter the promo code LOCKEDONCollege, they will throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. All right, folks, we're going to talk about Filip Petrusev today. He is hoping to play in the NBA this upcoming season. We discuss if he's ready to make that jump. We also take a look at the final two known Gonzaga transfer targets who both appear to have moved on and what that might mean for Mark Few's team. But first, we're going to continue to dive into conference realignment as that remains one of the primary talking points in college athletics right now in the offseason. Latest updates is another article from Dennis Dodd at CBS. He is the reporter doing most of the coverage on the Big 12 conference right now. And of course, lots about UConn, lots about Gonzaga, Colorado, everything that's going on in conference realignment seems to be kind of centered around the Big 12 conference. And so Dennis is a perfect person to have in mind for following on Twitter and reading their articles at CBS because it really kind of covers most of what's going on in this space. I want to talk about a handful of things that were mentioned in this latest article about Gonzaga and UConn. The biggest one is, we talked about this in a recent episode. You everyday listeners definitely heard this conversation. We talked about Gonzaga hiring a consulting firm, try that again, a consulting firm called Navigate, and they discussed their program that helps kind of these programs navigate Power 5 conferences. I think they've worked with 4 of the 5 traditional Power 5 conferences, and they're helping Gonzaga basically make their case for why they should be included in a Power 5 conference. One of the results that came out of this was that they have a metric called TV Power Rankings, which basically determine how much brand recognition, how much awareness, how much cachet your brand brings from a TV perspective. In college basketball, Gonzaga is fifth. And the 4 schools ahead of them are the 4 schools that almost anybody would guess. I'll give you a second to guess who they are. If you guessed Duke, North Carolina, Kansas, and Kentucky, you would have been correct. Gonzaga is 5th on that list. No other program, not Arkansas, not Michigan, not Michigan State, not anybody else in the SEC, anybody else in the Big 12. Those are the only 4 brands ahead of Gonzaga right now from a TV power perspective. Another fun fact out of this list is that the Zags TV ratings against Power 5 opponents are 2.5 times higher than the average TV ratings of a Big 12 game. Now, some of those numbers are a little bit skewed. Obviously, Gonzaga's Power 5 opponents, they don't tend to play low-level Power 5 opponents. They don't have a lot of matchups against Cal and Oregon State. They have matchups against teams like Arizona historically. Obviously, they play in big MTEs where they played teams like Duke in the past. And last year they played Texas and Baylor and Kentucky and so on and so forth. Whereas the average Big 12 game is a bit of a marker that can be kind of construed a lot of different ways. You got Oklahoma State and West Virginia and programs that are solid, but not necessarily driving as much TV revenue. But regardless, this is a pretty definitive proof that Gonzaga as a brand has enough cachet, has enough power, has enough pull to join a Power 5 conference. And this is the point of this Navigate consulting firm, is to prove that, is to get that data out there, is to show Brett Yormark, the commissioner of the Big 12, show the Big 12 presidents, the Big 12 athletic directors, the general populace that, hey, this isn't a program that's going to come into this conference and get buried and disappear. And the vast majority of people don't believe that, I don't think, at least. But this is a way to demonstrate like Gonzaga's brand. And we've talked about it a couple months ago in the NCAA tournament when every commercial it seemed. Chet Holmgren was in a bunch of commercials. Adam Morrison was in a bunch of commercials. Spike was in a bunch of commercials. Like, Gonzaga is all over college basketball. Their brand is constantly shown every single time you're talking about the sport, and for good reason. They've made the tournament dang near a quarter of a century in a row at this point. Like, this is a program that clearly deserves the kind of recognition that they're starting to get around the NCAA tournament and around the college basketball landscape. However, the Big 12 is looking at Gonzaga and UConn. And the report is that there is a mutual admiration between Gonzaga and Big 12. That is a direct quote from this article, again, by Dennis Dodd at CBS, but that UConn has more momentum right now. Of course, there are some obvious reasons for that. Number one, UConn was a better basketball team last year. That's not debatable. They beat the absolute tar out of Gonzaga in the NCAA tournament. They also won the dang national championship. They were a phenomenal basketball brand last year, and they have a historic staying power as a basketball brand. It's not like the equivalent of San Diego State or, all the way down to somebody like Florida Atlantic. No disrespect to those programs, but they had great years last year. They had better years than Gonzaga, but they don't have that history. San Diego State has good basketball history. It's not comparable to Gonzaga's. FAU's is not close to Gonzaga's. UConn's is. And they have 5 national championships in the last 25 years. They have one 2 months ago. They also have football, which is clearly a huge factor in this conversation. UConn has football. That means that the revenue distribution doesn't have to change as much. It makes things a lot easier. The other report that came out of this article that surprised me to see is that they're looking at Gonzaga as a basketball-only member. This would be men's and women's basketball, but it would not include baseball or soccer or volleyball or tennis or any of Gonzaga's other Olympic sports. I'm not sure. The article didn't go into any detail on what that would mean for Gonzaga, but that is a pretty significant hinge that I've talked about at length on this show, because I don't think the WCC is just going to continue to house Gonzaga's non-basketball sports. So what does that mean? I don't see Gonzaga athletic director Chris Standiford going to the baseball staff or the soccer staffs and saying, hey, we're going to push you guys into the big sky so we can bring our basketball programs over to the Big 12. I don't think that's going to fly. Maybe the WCC will keep them. Maybe I'm wrong about that assertion, but I have a hard time seeing it. We also saw a quote, direct quote from the CBS article. I'll read it right here. Quote, "It's no secret the Pac-12, a much better geographic fit for the Zags, is making a considerable push despite its current state." I didn't know that. It says it's no secret. That hasn't been something that's been talked about a bunch, that the Pac-12 is pursuing Gonzaga and making a considerable pitch. Of course, I understand why Mark Few in particular is wanting to wait out the Big 12 rather than joining the Pac-12, but there's a situation potentially developing where the Big 12 pursues UConn as a full member, adds them for every sport, of course, including football, and is only really willing to dangle Gonzaga as a basketball-only member with a smaller piece of the pie, a significantly smaller piece of the pie. Like, Gonzaga believes they're worth $15 million. They received that evaluation from this consulting firm, Navigate. If the Big 12 is offering half that, $7.5 million, and the Pac-12 is offering more money, less travel, and they'll take every program, they'll take baseball, they'll take soccer, all those other sports, I'm starting to wonder if that could be the reality here. And again, we don't know. That quote was the extent of what was said about Gonzaga and the Pac-12. There's more to that story that we're not seeing. Of course, the Pac-12 has been on the brink of seeming extinction forever. I've kind of never bought into that fully. But if the Pac-12 gets their stuff together, Colorado and Arizona don't leave, they keep their 10, they add San Diego State. That is all the best case scenario for the Pac-12. But if that happens, and they can turn around and pursue Gonzaga, do I think that would happen? I don't know. I think Mark Few is going to want to hold out for the Big 12, and I don't blame him. Big 12 is a considerably better basketball conference. Gonzaga joining a Pac-12 without UCLA and USC, yeah, they still have Arizona, if Arizona stays, which is a huge hinge here. If they add San Diego State, you have Arizona, you have San Diego State, you have Gonzaga, you have Oregon, you have Washington if they stay, which, we'll see how long they stay. That's a fine top half of a basketball conference, but it's not great. Is it better than the WCC? Yes, but it doesn't light a candle, doesn't hold a candle to the Big 12. It's not even close. So there's a lot of factors here. I will continue to keep you updated on as much conference realignment stuff as possible. I said this the last time we talked about realignment. I don't like talking about it every time an article comes out because a lot of times we don't have a lot of new information. But here, at least we got some new data points from Navigate, and we got this quote about the Pac-12, and I think there's some interesting things happening. I understand why UConn is the higher priority right now. I understand why Yormark wants both UConn and Gonzaga, but I understand why Gonzaga is at least feeling out some other options here because they may not be getting the money and the respect that they feel they deserve from the Big 12. And if that's the case, I wonder if they are willing to pivot towards another direction, which could include the Pac-12 conference. Well, Grant Nelson and Zyon Pullin each are down to 2 programs in their transfer portal search. Gonzaga is not on either list, which means we ask the important question: is that it for transfer portal movement for the Bulldogs this offseason? More coming up after a word from today's sponsor, Bird Dogs. I don't know how else to say this, so I'm just going to keep it simple. Bird Dogs shorts and pants, they make you look good. The Bird Dogs stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, giving you a truly sculpted look. And look, we could all use that help on our shorts. Bird Dog shorts do the exact same thing as Lululemon, but they fit way better. They also fit better than regular shorts made of stiff, restricting cotton. How? Bird Dogs fixed it by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks like khaki but stretches, so you get a slimmer fit without sacrificing movement. It also uses anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. So go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege and enter the promo code LOCKEDONCollege, one word, for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That's birddogs.com/lockedoncollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off, we promise you. All right, folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. For those of you joining us on YouTube, we got more fantastic stuff coming your way later this week. We did our season in review, season preview type episode for Caden Perry early this week. We'll continue to look at more of those for guys like Braden Huff, for an incoming guy like Alex Tui, Dusty Stromer, etc. We're going to continue to keep you updated on what's going on with conference realignment as we hear more and more stories here in the month of June. And of course, looking at the ahead to the NBA draft, Julian Strother, Drew Timme, what's going on with those two guys, where they might be playing professional basketball next season. But for now, I want to have another conversation about the transfer portal because we're probably running out of time to talk about the transfer portal. And I got to be honest with you, I have loved talking about the transfer portal. It is so fun to get a chance to look at players from different teams, guys who might fit at Gonzaga, take a look at the various options out there at different positions, how they performed at different schools, all of that good stuff. But as we talked about on Monday's episode, for you everyday listeners, I know you caught that, we discussed whether Gonzaga was done making more additions. Because right now Gonzaga has 2 roster spots open. Anton Watson's return, Malachi Smith's departure gave them 2 spots in open scholarships. But if Gonzaga believes that they have an 8-man rotation out of the players they currently have on the roster, then they might not make any more additions. You're not going to add a player who's not going to play. Most likely. We'll get to that momentarily. There are 2 players that were known to be connected to Gonzaga who are still available in the transfer portal. Those are Grant Nelson from North Dakota State and Zyon Pullin from UC Riverside. Grant Nelson, as we're speaking right now, is visiting with Arkansas and Alabama. Those are his 2 visits this week. He canceled his visit to Waco, Texas with Scott Drew and the Baylor Bears, and by all accounts is choosing between those 2 SEC powerhouses, Nate Oates and the Crimson Tide, and Eric Musselman and the Razorbacks. And I think I see both options as very appealing for him, but I'm also very not surprised that Gonzaga did not make this list. Anton Watson's return pretty much killed the momentum for adding a player like Grant Nelson. And I'm okay with that. I love Grant Nelson. Folks who heard me talk about him at least 3-4 times on this podcast throughout the last month. He's a unicorn type player. If the outside shooting ticks up a little bit, there's reasons he's drawn loose comparisons to Chet Holmgren. He's not as good as Chet Holmgren. Very, very few people on the planet are as good as Chet Holmgren at basketball, but Nelson is 6'11". He can handle the basketball. He's a good finisher around the rim. He's a good shot blocker, and he's got an outside shot. He was less consistent with it last year, but it is definitely there. But once the Zags added Anton Watson, and of course they already added Graham Ike, and Ben Gregg's in line for a bigger role next year, that's pretty much your whole rotation right there in the front court. You also have Caden Perry, who we talked about at length on Tuesday's episode of Locked On Zags. You have Braden Huff, who's coming off a redshirt year, who's expecting to play more minutes. You could play Yo or Tui, the 2 freshmen coming in as small ball forwards potentially. So there's just a lot of options in Gonzaga's front court. And while Grant Nelson is better than many of them, and would deserve to play over them, it would create a logjam of minutes. And I'm not sure what would happen after that. Whether you wouldn't be able to see anybody else enter the transfer portal other than Watson, which I don't think he would do, but you would have too many players, too many mouths to feed in the front court. So I'm not surprised to see Nelson move on. Alabama in particular has a desperate need for players in the front court after Charles Bediako declared for the NBA draft. Arkansas has added primarily to their guard rotation and needs more help in the front court as well. So those are two schools that make a lot of sense for Nelson and his skill set. Meanwhile, Zyon Pullin is down to two programs as well. Those would be Florida and LSU. I mentioned Florida immediately as a potential option for Pullin when he listed them in his top five, in part because as a four-year player at UC Riverside, I suspect Todd Golden had a lot of exposure to him, saw him play, potentially recruited him out of high school to come to San Francisco. I don't know for sure if that happened, but they seem to have a close relationship. Pullin and Golden were together on his recruiting trip. He went out and visited at Florida and has listed them in his top two. I think that's a very logical landing spot for Pullin with the Gators. LSU makes a lot of sense too. They've added a couple of guards in the transfer portal. They've also lost a couple of guards in the transfer portal. They did add Carlos Stewart out of Santa Clara, who was very, very good for the Broncos last year. But I think that both those programs make a lot of sense for Pullin, and I would have loved to see him at Gonzaga, though. I mentioned that Grant Nelson didn't really seem like an obvious fit after Anton Watson returned. However, for Pullin, Malachi Smith's departure kind of cleared a spot for him. Pullin's 6'4" guard, averaged close to 20 points per game last year, 4-year guy, bigger physical guard, decent defender. Like, he kind of fit that Malachi Smith role. He looked a lot like what Malachi Smith looked like at Chattanooga at UC Riverside, and I think would have kind of handled that role smoothly had he come to Gonzaga and joined the Bulldogs. He may not have wanted to take on that role, and he wants to go to a program like Florida or LSU where he's going to play much more minutes, potentially, and I get that. It's totally understandable to not want to transfer somewhere where you're going to probably come off the bench, but I'm curious what this means for Gonzaga now. Because if they believe their 8-man rotation is set, and the things that need to be determined for them to feel that way are whether they feel like Yo and Stromer are going to be ready to contribute on day one. Because if those two guys are ready to be in a rotation, then I think Gonzaga is probably done in the transfer portal. Because we talked about the front court, Watson, EK, Ben Gregg, all three of those guys are going to play big minutes. In the backcourt, you have Nemhard, you have Hickman, you have Steele Venters. That's 6 right there. Those 6 guys are going to be in the rotation next year. There is no debate, no ifs, no ands, no buts. Those 6 guys, bam, in the rotation. You got 2 more spots after that. If they believe Yo and Stromer are ready, bam, that's your 8-man rotation right there with guys like Caden Perry, Braden Huff, Alex Toohey, kind of 8, 9, 10, 11 on that rotation. If they don't feel that either of those guys are ready, whether they want Stromer to be on the outside of the rotation, kind of like Dominic Harris was his freshman year, or even Julian Strother his freshman year, then you probably want another addition. That's where a player like Pullin would have come in. He's your 8th man or your 6th or 7th man. He helps fill out that 8-man rotation, and then you have Stromer kind of waiting in the wings to take on a bigger role as a sophomore. So to me, Gonzaga not making any more additions could potentially indicate that they feel confident with the eight-man rotation that they currently have on the roster. But even if they do, that doesn't mean they won't make any additions or can't make any additions. They could look at a player who is in the portal, who has already transferred, who would need to sit out a year. Of course, many players who are in that boat are doing their very best to transfer to places where they can get a waiver to play right away, a la Efton Reed, who as of this recording, I do not believe has confirmed whether he is going to be able to play right away for Wake Forest, but that was part of the reason he chose to transfer there, was the hope that he would get a waiver. But if Gonzaga could find a young player who's maybe transferred already once and is looking at coming to a program where they can develop behind the scenes and maybe blossom into a bigger role the following year, I could see them trying to add a player of that ilk. It's just a pretty specific player type, and there may not be very many available, and certainly not very many available who Gonzaga would feel is worthwhile of putting on scholarship. Let's put it that way. So there are still some options. Of course, the transfer portal is not technically over. The portal closed on May 11th, but graduate transfers can still enter the portal. There's a player like Antonio Reeves, who withdrew from the NBA draft and is in theory going back to Kentucky, but many believe he will enter the transfer portal as a grad transfer. He can do that at any point. Would Gonzaga pursue Antonio Reeves? I'm not sure. I'm not sure he's a great fit for what the team needs necessarily, but there are going to be more players who continue to crop up as options. So what I'm saying is I'm not quite sure I'm done talking about the transfer portal. We might look at some more options later down the line if we continue to feel like maybe there are some players out there worthwhile for Gonzaga to pursue in the transfer portal. But I also wouldn't be surprised if they're done. And again, a longer conversation about this was had on Monday's episode. So if you have not seen that yet or listened to that yet, go check it out in your feed. But for right now, I think there's a fairly good chance that Gonzaga is not going to make any additions to their roster outside of maybe a walk-on of sorts. Maybe they'll put one of their walk-ons on scholarship since they have a couple spots. Maybe they'll keep them open for 2023 late commits. Maybe a 2024 player that they add will reclassify to 2023. That's probably unlikely at this point in the offseason, but there are some things that could potentially happen to change Gonzaga's roster between now and November 6th, but there also might not be. This might be it. And there's nothing wrong with that. I feel pretty darn good about this roster, as you heard on Monday's episode, but it's something to keep an eye on because the two players we knew that were at least connected to Gonzaga in the transfer portal, they're not going there. So what does that mean? We'll find out. Don't worry. We'll keep you posted on the transfer portal if there is any updates, if there is any news, if there are any players that I think might make some sense. But I ultimately think that might be a conversation that is kind of getting put to bed for the rest of the offseason as we start transitioning towards some other topics like Zags in the NBA, which is what I want to talk about to close out the show, looking at Filip Petrusev after a recent article proclaimed his interest in playing for the Philadelphia 76ers this year. Is that something that could end up happening finally for the Serbian big man? More on that coming up right after this. Segment 3 here, still Andy Patton, still locked on Zags. Switching over to talk about Filip Petrusev, who, of course, played at Gonzaga a couple of years ago, was kind of pushed out by Drew Timme after Drew's dominant freshman season as a backup for the Zags. Petrusev ended up declaring for the NBA draft, and he was selected 50th overall in the 2021 NBA draft by the Philadelphia 76ers. He has not played for Philadelphia since that time, as he has had his contracts remain overseas up to that point. But Philadelphia still has those rights, and they still could sign him to a two-way contract. They could sign him to an NBA contract. They could find a way to fill him onto a spot in the roster. Petrusev has played in the summer league the last couple of years in an attempt to kind of prove his worth, prove his spot in the NBA is deserved. Last year in the summer league, he averaged 5.5 points, 2.3 rebounds, 1 assist, and 1 steal, which was not determined to be enough for him to land a highly coveted, mind you, roster spot with the 76ers. He ended up playing with Vena Zvijda in the ABA, the Adriatic League. And he put up some really good numbers there, 10.7 points, 5.2 rebounds in 24 games. In the 24 games that Petrusev played for this team, they went 21-3. He shot just under 60% from the field and 52.5% from the three-point line. It was a relatively small sample size, but regardless, Petrusev has showed the outside shooting ability. He has showed the low post scoring ability. He has flashed more of an ability to handle the basketball, which is not something he did at Gonzaga, but he showed more of that in his career overseas. And now that we're seeing the three-point shooting ability start to show up, you're really seeing a player who looks more like a modern big. He looks more like a modern NBA big. And I think that is what he's been working on in Europe and why he is pretty confident about this. So the quote here in this article was from Filip Petrusev's agent. He said a handful of things, but one thing he directly said is, quote, "I think that Filip will be in the NBA next season." Of course, he's an agent. He's going to gas up his guys. I get that. I don't know that you want to look too seriously into what an agent would say, but the 76ers did not draft Filip Petrusev to never, ever play him. Their hope is that he's an NBA player. Philip's hope is that he's an NBA player. Philip's agent hope, of course, is that he's an NBA player. So everybody wants the same thing here. For the 76ers, it's a matter of, is he one of the 12, 13, 14 best players that we could have on our roster? It's hard to make the NBA. They don't have very big rosters. And for Filip, he has made it clear, or at least his agent made it clear, that he's either going to re-sign with this same team, Vena Zvijda, or he's going to play in the NBA. That is it. His agent said, we're not looking at other European teams. We're not looking at the Euro. We're just looking at him. He's dead set on making the NBA if by August he does not have an NBA contract. We will then renegotiate contract stuff with Zvijda. So that's where he's at. And that makes sense. I think that's a very clean, clear, crisp statement from his agent to basically say NBA or bust for Petrusev. And bust is kind of a mean way to describe returning to his old team, but that's his goal. He doesn't want to go somewhere else. He doesn't want to keep moving around. He either wants to play in the best league in basketball, or he wants to stay in the same team that he's on last year. I think it'd be very cool to see Petrusev make the NBA. I think we have seen his game, and I'm not going to pretend I've watched a ton of his basketball in the ABA league, but we've seen highlights. We can look at the numbers. We can kind of parse out what we've seen from him with the summer league stuff. Again, he only averaged 5.5 points last year in I think 4 or 5 games. Summer league is really tough to prove yourself. It's really, if that's all teams are going on, it's really hard. Hopefully he can do a little bit more than that, showcase a little bit more in summer league, but also just kind of his tape might hopefully entice some of the Philadelphia people to give him a chance, because I do think that there's an NBA player there. Do I think he's a NBA starting center? No. Do I even think he's like a 20 minute per game backup? Maybe that's the ceiling for Filip Petrusev, but could he be a guy who plays at this level? Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's always fun to have more Zags in the NBA. I know Petrusev is not exactly like a fan favorite, I guess we'll put it that way. I don't think there's any reason to dislike Petrusev. I think his early departure certainly surprised a lot of people, but it had more to do with Drew Timme than it had to do with Petrusev himself. And I think getting mad at Petrusev for allowing Drew Timme to become Drew Timme is kind of silly. I'm not saying anybody feels that way necessarily, but that's effectively what happened. As Petrusev left, went back to Serbia, played a dominant season in Serbia. So it was beneficial for Petrusev to dominate in Serbia. And it was beneficial for Gonzaga for Petrusev to be gone because it allowed Drew Timme to blossom into Drew Timme as a sophomore. It was a win-win situation. Petrusev's departure was a win-win situation for Petrusev, for Gonzaga, for Drew Timme. And so I think that it's something that should be celebrated. And I think we should want to see more Zags in the NBA. Petrusev coming to join the NBA, if Julian Strawther sticks on a roster, if Drew Timme sticks on a roster, if Petrusev sticks on a roster, I think that would put them up to 12, I believe. 12 Zags in the NBA. Man, it is fun to see this continue to grow, continue to develop, continue to see more consistent professional aspirations coming out of Gonzaga. This list is going to continue to grow. There are players on Gonzaga's current roster who are probably going to be NBA players. Maybe Andrew's younger brother, Ryan, will join him in the NBA someday. Perhaps Anton Watson, if the outside shooting ticks up a little bit, maybe he's going to be an NBA player. Yo and Stromer are younger guys that we haven't seen all that much, but they could end up developing into NBA guys as well. Like there's a lot of NBA talent shuffling in and out of this Gonzaga basketball program. And a player like Petrusev kind of gets lost in that shuffle a little bit, doesn't get remembered quite as well because of his short tenure in Gonzaga and because because Drew Timme took over after him and kind of made it hard to forget who was there before him. But I think it'd be really cool to see Petrusev in the NBA. We'll continue to keep you updated on Petrusev's chase for the NBA, as well as, of course, Julian Strawther and Drew Timme's chase for the NBA, Malachi Smith, Rasir Bolton. Those guys have outside shots of getting at least summer league invitations and potentially parlaying that into an NBA career as well. So there's a lot of professional Zag stuff coming up your way later here on the show. Of course, we're kind of moving away from talking too much about the transfer portal, so some of that transition is going to lead to more conversations about those professional Zags and their aspirations right here on the Locked On Zags podcast. And that's going to do it for me today. So thank you for sticking it out. Thank you for checking us out here on YouTube. For those of you who are checking it out there, thanks, of course, to the everyday listeners. Shout out to you, whether it's your first 10th, 100th, 200th, 350th episode of Locked On Zags. I very much appreciate every single one of you. More fantastic stuff coming your way later this week. But for now, thank you all for listening, and go Zags.